I spent 8 years being angry at my sister. 8 years of silence, of unreturned birthday cards, of a seat left empty at every important table, graduation, my wedding, the birth of my daughter. 8 years of telling myself that she had chosen to leave, that she didn't care, that some people simply do not love you the way you need them to. I was so certain I was right. I was so completely, devastatingly wrong. Her name is Diane. She is 4 years older than me, 41 now, to my 37, and the story of why she disappeared and what she was doing in that disappearance and what it cost her to stay silent all those years, it is the most humbling thing I have ever had to understand. Because she wasn't cold. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't the person I had built in my mind over 8 years of hurt and confusion. She was protecting me. And I had no idea. To understand what happened, you have to understand what came before. Diane and I grew up in a small house in rural Georgia. Our mother was warm and chaotic and full of life. Our father was the kind of man who filled a room loudly, completely, and not always in ways that felt safe. He wasn't violent, I want to be clear about that, but he was volatile, unpredictable. There were years when money was tight and the tension in our house was a living thing, something you navigated around the way you navigate furniture in the dark. Diane, being older, understood more. She positioned herself between me and whatever the difficult thing of the day was. Not dramatically, she didn't make a show of it. She was simply always there, in the way that older siblings sometimes are. A buffer, a translator, a hand that appeared at your shoulder at exactly the right moment. I adored her. That is not too strong a word. She was the person I told everything to. She was the first person I called with any news, good or bad. When I got into college, the first in our family, she cried harder than I did. When I started dating my husband Marco, she approved of him within the first 10 minutes, which I took as a more meaningful endorsement than anything else. We were, in every sense of the phrase, best friends. And then, when I was 29 years old and newly engaged and happier than I had ever been in my life, she left. No fight, no argument I could point to, no dramatic falling out. She simply began to pull away, slowly at first, and then all at once. Calls went unanswered, visits were canceled, excuses arrived in short apologetic messages that contained nothing I could actually hold on to. And then, silence. I tried everything. In the first year, I tried patience. She was going through something, I told myself. Give her space. She'll come back. In the second year, I tried reaching out, letters, messages, showing up at her apartment once, to find her not home or unwilling to answer. I stood at her door for 20 minutes, and then I left. By the third year, the hurt had begun to calcify into something harder. I stopped reaching. I told myself I was protecting myself, that you could only extend your hand so many times before you had to accept that it wasn't going to be taken. I told my mother that Diane had chosen this. My mother, to her credit, never agreed with me. She would get a quiet, careful look on her face whenever Diane came up, and she would say things like, "She loves you, Nora. I promise you that much." I thought it was a mother's need to believe the best of both her daughters. I thought my mother was wrong. I got married without Diane. There is a photograph from my wedding, my favorite photograph from that day, of me and Marco and my mother and my two closest friends. When I look at it now, I see the empty space where Diane should have been. I did not see it then. I had trained myself not to. My daughter Lily was born when I was 34. I sent Diane a card. A photograph. 3 lines saying that she had a niece if she ever wanted one. No reply. I grieve Diane the way you grieve someone who is still alive, which is, in some ways, the hardest kind of grief. Because there is no closure, there is no ceremony, there is only the recurring, unanswerable question, why? I had no answer. For 8 years, I had no answer. And then I met a woman named Patricia in the waiting room of a hospital. Lily had broken her arm. A fall from the monkey bars at school, clean fracture, the doctor said. Nothing serious, but we had spent 3 hours in the emergency room waiting for x-rays and a cast, and by the time we were moved to a smaller waiting area, I was exhausted and she had fallen asleep against my shoulder. The woman sitting across from me was perhaps 65. Silver-haired, the kind of face that had clearly been through things and emerged, not unscathed, but intact. She smiled at Lily sleeping on my shoulder in the way that older people sometimes smile at children, with a particular tenderness, like recognition. We got to talk the way strangers do in waiting rooms, carefully at first about small things, and then somehow less carefully. She told me she was there for her son. Routine procedure, nothing to worry about. I told her about Lily's arm, and then she asked, the way some people simply do, whether I had other children and then whether I had siblings. I said I had a sister, and something in my voice must have carried the 8 years, because she looked at me with that steady gaze and said, "That sounds complicated." I laughed. That's one word for it. And I found myself telling her, this stranger, this silver-haired woman in a hospital waiting room, the outline of the story. The closeness, the disappearance, the silence, the years of not understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Can I ask you something?" When she left, was there anything difficult happening in your life at that time? Something she might have known about that you perhaps didn't? I started to say no. And then I stopped. Because there was something, I had simply never connected it to Diane. Around the time Diane disappeared, I had been receiving messages, anonymous ones, sent to my email, to a social media account, once to my workplace. Threatening in tone, not specific enough to take to the police, but disturbing enough to shake me. They referenced things about my personal life, my address, my daily routine, in ways that made it clear that whoever was sending they had been watching. It had lasted about 8 months, and then, as suddenly as they had started, the messages stopped. I had never known why. I had been relieved, told Marco, moved on. It became one of those unresolved, unsettling chapters of a life, something that had happened, something I had survived, something I did not entirely understand. I had never told Diane, or I hadn't thought I had. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, the woman's question hanging in the air, I remembered something I had forgotten entirely. I had mentioned the first message to Diane, casually in a phone call, not even as a serious concern, more as a strange, slightly creepy thing that had happened. I had made light of it. I had moved on in the conversation. I had completely forgotten that I had told her, but Diane had not forgotten. I drove home from the hospital that night, with Lily asleep in the back seat, and a feeling in my chest I can only describe as the sensation of a long locked door beginning to open. I called my mother. I told her what the woman in the waiting room had said. I told her what I had remembered. There was a silence on the phone. And then my mother said very quietly, "Nora, I think you need to talk to your sister." I called Diane the next morning. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting, as if maybe some part of her had always known this call would come eventually. "Nora," she said, just my name, the way she used to say it. I didn't know where to start, so I just said, "The messages, 8 years ago. You knew something." A long silence. And then she told me, the person sending those messages, it was someone she knew, someone from her own life. A man she had briefly dated before I met Marco, a man who had become obsessive and frightening in ways she had not anticipated. When she discovered that his attention had shifted from her to me, when she found evidence that he had my address, that he had been following my movements, she made a choice. She confronted him herself, told him that if he came anywhere near me, she would go to the police with everything she had on him. She made herself the target, the threat, the point of conflict to pull his focus away from me. And it had worked. The messages to me stopped, but he had promised her that if she maintained contact with me, if she was in my life, visible, reachable, he would find another way to get to me through her, a disturbed mind building a disturbed logic. And Diane, terrified, had believed him, had chosen to believe him because the alternative, staying close to me and risking that she might somehow lead danger to my door, was something she could not accept. So she left. She had moved to another city, built a new, quieter life, watched from a safe distance as I got married, had Lily, lived the life she had decided to protect at the cost of her own presence in it. She had never told me because she was afraid that knowing would make me feel guilty, responsible, and unsafe. She had decided on her own, in the way of people who love very deeply and very silently, that I was better off without the truth. When she finished speaking, I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. "You gave up 8 years," I said. 8 years of us. And she said, and I will hear this for the rest of my life, she said, I would give up 8 more if it meant you were safe. The man who had sent those messages had, in the years since, made the same mistake with someone else. Someone who had gone to the police, who had pressed charges, who had seen it through. He had a record now, a restraining order. The consequences of his obsession had followed him the way such things always eventually do. Karma is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is more often an accumulation, a slow accounting, a life catching up to the choices made within it. Diane and I have been talking every day for the past 6 months, sometimes long calls, sometimes just a few minutes. We are rebuilding, carefully, honestly, with full knowledge of what was lost and what remains. She met Lily for the first time 3 months ago. Lily, who is 6 and therefore processes the world with complete pragmatic efficiency, accepted Aunt Diane within approximately 4 minutes and then asked her if she knew how to French braid hair. Diane does, as it turns out. I watched them sit together on the living room floor, my sister's hands moving through my daughter's hair, and I had to leave the room for a moment. Not because I was sad, though there is still sadness in it, but because it was too much goodness to hold all at once after 8 years of absence. I think about the woman in the hospital waiting room often. I don't know her last name. I don't know how to find her. But one stranger asking one quiet question in a waiting room on an ordinary Tuesday night gave me back my sister. I don't think that's coincidence. I think some things find their way home exactly when they're supposed to. Not every lie is an act of cruelty. Some lies are the shape that love takes when love runs out of other options, when the person who cares for you most decides, quietly and at great cost to themselves, that your safety matters more than your understanding. If there is someone in your life who has gone quiet, who is pulled away in ways you don't understand, I'm not saying they are always protecting you. Sometimes distance is simply distance, but sometimes the people who love you most are the ones standing just outside the light, making sure nothing gets through to you, and you may never know. Or you may find out, one ordinary night, in a hospital waiting room. This has been Soul Tales. I'm Nora. And Diane, if you're listening, thank you. For every year, for every silence, for choosing me, even when it meant losing us.